She parked two massive trucks in my driveway without asking, and then she had the nerve to file a $2,000 HOA complaint against me for, quote, unauthorized commercial activity, quote, before the engine blocks were even cool. But what she didn't oppose, know was that I'd already leased that garage to the county sheriff, and she was about to find out exactly what happens when you declare war on a man who documents everything. My name's Frank, and at 62, I've learned that life usually boils down to two things: how much you're willing to put up with, and how well you keep your receipts. I spent 34 years under the hoods of trucks at a Freightliner shop out in West Texas, which means I know exactly what a radiator leak smells like from 50 yards away, and I sure as hell know a snake when I see one sliding through the grass. After my wife, Martha, passed away from a sudden stroke 4 years ago, I retreated to our little ranch house in a quiet patch of Oak Creek, a place we'd built together back when the only things around us were cattle and mesquite trees. But the world has a way of catching up to you, and before I knew it, a developer had swallowed the surrounding fields. A gate went up at the entrance, and suddenly I was living in a, quote, managed community, quote, governed by people who think a mailbox being 2 inches too low is a federal offense. Martha's medical bills had been a mountain I was still climbing, and between my disability check and a thin pension, the numbers just weren't an oppos, adding up anymore. Until an old friend from the force mentioned the county was looking for secure off-site storage for tactical gear and overflow evidence that didn't fit in the main precinct. My detached 3-car garage was built like a fortress, reinforced concrete, climate-controlled, and isolated from the main house. We signed a formal lease 18 months ago, $400 a month, that literally kept the lights on, and my German Shepherd, Duke, fed. Deputy Miller would roll through twice a week in an unmarked SUV, respectful as could be, just swapping out gear or checking inventory. It was the perfect, quiet arrangement, or at least it was until Victoria moved in next door. Victoria was the kind of woman who treated a cul-de-sac like her private kingdom, arriving 6 months ago with a husband who worked offshore and a landscaping business that she ran like a paramilitary operation. She was all fake smiles and expensive highlights until she realized I wasn't an oppos. She going to spend my weekends manicuring my lawn to her personal specifications, and within 6 weeks, she'd clawed her way onto the HOA board, crowning herself the queen of, quote, aesthetic standards, quote. She drove a company truck that looked like a monster truck's bigger brother and a secondary dually pickup that she'd park on the curb just to be a nuisance. But apparently, even that wasn't an oppos. Enough space for her ego. It all came to a head on a Tuesday morning, 6 a.m. sharp. I walked out to the porch with my coffee, and the air just felt wrong, thick with the heavy, cloying scent of diesel exhaust and the metallic, quote, ping, 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 quote, of cooling engines. Sitting right there on my concrete apron, blocking the sheriff's access to my garage, were both of her massive trucks. Oil was already weeping onto my clean floor, and when I looked up, I saw Victoria standing in her kitchen window, holding a mug and wearing a smirk so sharp it could have cut glass. She didn't oppose, move, didn't oppose, wave. She just watched me, like she'd finally cornered the old man she'd been trying to push out since the day she arrived. I knocked on her door, trying to keep my voice steady despite the adrenaline spiking in my chest. I said, quote, Victoria, you've got to move these. Deputy Miller is due here in an hour for a gear swap, and I can't have a driveway blocked. Quote. She didn't oppose, even open the screen door, just looked through the mesh and said, quote, it's a temporary overflow, Frank. Maybe if you didn't oppose, have such a cluttered, industrial-looking eyesore of a garage, I'd have more respect for your property lines. But honestly, I'm doing the neighborhood a favor by taking up the visual space, quote, before I could even respond, she handed me a crisp, white envelope. It was a formal violation notice from the HOA, accusing me of running a commercial warehouse in a residential zone and demanding a $2,000 fine effective immediately. She thought she'd won. She thought she'd found the one pressure point that would break me. But Victoria made the mistake of assuming a retired mechanic doesn't oppose. Know how to read a blueprint. I spent the next 3 days at the county records office, breathing in the smell of old dust and stagnant ink, digging through the original covenants of Oak Creek from 1985. You see, when these developers buy up land and slap an HOA on it, They often forget that the existing structures, the ones built decades before the association was a twinkle in a lawyer and oppos, SI, are protected by what we call grandfathered use. I found the original deed, signed and stamped, showing my garage was permitted and completed 15 years before the HOA was even incorporated, and there it was in black and white, existing outbuildings and their utility shall remain exempt from subsequent residential-only covenants, But I didn't oppose. T stopped there because if Victoria wanted to play a game of rules, I was going to make sure I knew the rule book better than the person who wrote it. I looked up her business license and the municipal codes for, commercial vehicle storage, And what do you know? The city had a strict ordinance against parking vehicles over 12,000 pounds in a residential driveway overnight without a special permit. Victoria had 3 of them, and she didn't oppose. T have a single permit on file. The emergency HOA meeting was held in a dimly lit community room that smelled like burnt coffee and nervous sweat. Victoria was sitting right in the middle of the board table, looking like a judge at the Salem witch trials. She started in on me immediately, talking about, property values, neighborhood character, her voice dripping with that fake concern that makes your skin crawl. She said, Mr. Harrison, we simply cannot allow a police depot to operate in a family-friendly zone. It's dangerous, it's commercial, and it's a liability, I let her finish, let her get real comfortable in that chair, and then I stood up and slid my research across the table. I said, Well, Victoria, it's funny you mention an oppos, neighborhood character, and oppos, because according to the 1985 county filing, my property is exempt from every single one of your regulations regarding outbuilding use. But more importantly, let's talk about your trucks, I pulled out timestamp photos of her vehicles, along with the manufacturer's weight specs and a letter from the City Code Enforcement Office. You've been illegally storing commercial fleet vehicles on residential soil for 6 months. That's a $500 a day fine from the city, which I believe totals about $90,000 if they decide to backdate it. The silence in that room was so heavy you could have felt it in your bones. The other board members, most of whom were just tired retirees who Victoria had bullied into submission, started looking at her like she was radioactive. Frank Morrison, an old postman who'd lived 3 doors down for 20 years, actually started laughing. He looked at Victoria and said, Looks like you dug a hole and fell right in it. Didn't an oppos, to you? She went from pale to a deep, bruised purple in about 3 seconds, but she didn't an oppos. T apologized. She just stood up, grabbed her purse, and hissed, This ISN and oppos. T over, Frank. You think you and oppos. Re smart, but you and oppos. Re just an old man living in the past, That's when the, Cold War, turned hot. And that's when Victoria, I keep wanting to call her Brenda because she's such a classic version of one, started getting truly desperate. The Quan Quit Quay Roy, the harassment, it became a daily routine. I'd wake up to find my home, Thursday, my mailbox, wobbling because someone had loosened the bolts or my garden hose cut into ribbons. Then came the insurance claim. I got a notice in the mail saying Victoria was suing me for $4,000 because Deputy Miller's SUV had supposedly, sideswiped, her custom cedar fence during a gear pickup. I walked over to the fence with Duke, and the damage, was so obviously fake, it was insulting. It smelled like fresh paint thinner, and the scratches were perfectly horizontal, like someone had used a ruler and a putty knife to gouge the wood. It didn't an oppos. T matched the height of a bumper, and it sure as hell didn't an oppos. T have any paint transfer. But here's the thing about Victoria. She forgot that she wasn't an oppos. T the only one with eyes. My neighbor Mildred, who's 78 and doesn't an oppos. T miss a single thing that happens on this street, had installed a Ring doorbell camera after Victoria's trucks started tearing up the curbs. Mildred called me over for, T, which was really just an excuse to show me a video from 11:30 p.m. the previous Sunday. There was Victoria, clear as day under the street lamp, wearing a tracksuit and holding a scraper, working on that fence like she was carving a masterpiece. You could actually hear her muttering to herself about, getting that old bastard, End quote. I didn't oppose. T say a word to Victoria. I just called the insurance investigator, a guy named Carl who looked like he'd seen every scam since the dawn of time. When I showed him the video and he compared it to Victoria's, end quote, evidence, end quote, he just sighed and said, end quote, Mr. Harrison, this ISN and oppose. T just a denied claim. This is felony insurance fraud. End quote. But the real breaking point, the moment this went from a neighbor feud to a community crisis, was the fire. A few blocks over, Mrs. Gable's kitchen caught fire on a Thursday afternoon. It should have been a quick response, but the fire department found their primary access route blocked by a series of heavy construction barriers that Victoria had, end quote, arranged, end quote, to be delivered and dropped in the middle of the street, claiming she was, end quote, improving the drainage, end quote, for her landscaping business. The fire truck had to back out and circle around 3 blocks, losing 4 precious minutes while an 80-year-old woman was trapped in a smoke-filled house. Mrs. Gable survived, thank God, but she was in the ICU for a week with smoke inhalation, and the fire chief was absolutely livid. He found out those barriers were placed without a single city permit, ordered by Victoria's company, and placed specifically to spite the, end quote, traffic, end quote, she claimed was being caused by the sheriff's presence at my house. At that point, the sheriff's department didn't oppose. T just see this as a civil matter anymore. They saw it as criminal endangerment. The final act happened at the town council meeting. It was packed, standing room only, and the air was buzzing with a kind of righteous anger I haven and oppose. T seen in this town in 40 years. Victoria showed up with a lawyer who looked like he cost more than my house, trying to play the victim one last time. She stood up and said, end quote, I'm a small business owner trying to protect this community from the industrialization and danger brought in by Mr. Harrison and his associates, end quote. I didn't oppose. T give a speech. I just walked up to the microphone and played a recording. You see, the day before, Victoria had come to my back gate. She thought she could buy me off. On the recording, her voice is crystal clear, offering me $20,000 in cash to, end quote, make this all go away, end quote, and terminate my lease with the county. And then, when I didn't oppose, T answered right away. She said the words that sealed her fate. She said, end quote, you know, Frank, dogs like that German Shepherd of yours, they have accidents all the time. It would be a shame if he got out into the street while you're being so stubborn, end quote. The gas that went through that room was like a physical wave. You don and oppose. T threatened a man's dog in Texas, and you sure as hell don and oppose. T do it while the mayor and the district attorney are listening. Victoria's lawyer put his head in his hands, and she just stood there, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The deputy district attorney stood up right then and there and said, and quote, Victoria Thompson, I think you should step out into the hallway. There are some officers who would like to discuss the definitions of bribery, extortion, and criminal endangerment with you. End quote. They let her out in handcuffs while the whole room cheered. It was the most satisfying sound I've heard since Martha was still around to laugh at my jokes. Chuck, her husband, looked like he wanted to sink into the floorboards. He ended up filing for divorce before her first court date. It turned out Victoria had been doing this for years, targeting older residents, harassing them until they sold their land for pennies on the dollar, so she could flip the properties or use them for her business expansion. She was an oppose, TA, end quote, concerned neighbor, end quote. She was a predator with a HOA badge. Now, 3 months later, the neighborhood is different. It's quieter, but in a good way. The new family that moved into Victoria's old place is a young couple with 2 kids who actually come over to help me pull weeds, and Duke spends most of his afternoons getting belly rubs through the fence. My lease with the county was officially expanded to include the fire department's emergency backup gear, and that extra income allowed me to start a small scholarship fund in Martha's name for kids wanting to go into trade schools. It's a way to keep her memory alive and help the kind of people who actually build things instead of tearing them down. But I still wonder sometimes, how many Victorias are out there right now, sitting on HOA boards, looking for the next person to bully? We like to think that justice is automatic, but at ISN and oppose, it takes a community that's willing to look out for each other, and it takes people who aren't in oppose, afraid to stand up and say, end quote, not on my watch, end quote. So I've got to ask you, have you ever dealt with a neighbor who thought they owned the whole street? How far would you go to protect your home and your peace of mind? Drop a comment below and let me know your stories. I read every single one of them. And if you want to hear more stories of people who refuse to back down, hit that subscribe button and join our little community. Because as long as there are bullies, we'll be here to tell the stories of the people who beat them. Thanks for listening, and keep your cameras running. Would you like me to tell you about the time the HOA tried to fine me for the color of my dog and Oppos? As for next,